Okay, we're gonna get started here, we're in Judges starting tonight, and we're gonna focus mostly on chapter 2, though I'm gonna kind of mention some things in chapter 1. We'll focus in chapter 2 tonight, and then next week we'll mostly focus on chapter 3. But before we get started, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we are so grateful to be able to gather in peace and to be able to meditate and read your word, that we might grow in wisdom and understanding. And we pray for your wisdom. Grant us wisdom that we might be able to understand better, and that we might be able to make applications to our own lives and understand the successes and failures of those who have gone before us in this walk of faith. And so we thank you for this opportunity. And we know all of this comes because of what Jesus has done for us and giving himself so that we could have this opportunity to be your children, to be your church. And we thank you for him and all that he's done for us. In his name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I do want to just point out a few things in chapter 1 that really help us understand a little bit more about the book of Joshua. So I don't know if you remember, after they go through, if you can give me control, that'd be great. You know, after they go through, I'm just going to go back here a little bit. So these are. So this is really the first battles that happened in Canaan as they crossed over the Jordan and came in and battled all of these peoples and kings to the south. And then after they did that, you know, they had battles up north and defeated in fairly short order. We don't know the exact time frame these things happened. But we shouldn't think it happened like one day and then the next day, because Caleb goes 5 years after they have entered to ask Joshua for the land that he was promised by Moses. And he starts the allotting of land to all the people, to all the Israelites in Canaan. And so when we come to it, so his area is actually Hebron. That's a city that Caleb was given. And then it records for us, though, how Caleb took it, and then how, and we're going to find out some more about Othniel, who will be the first judge. But Othniel, who conquered Debir, when Caleb said, hey, you know, he can conquer Debir, you can marry my daughter. And that's Othniel, and then he conquered. So we read about all that, and it reads like it happened fairly quickly. But we get into Judges chapter 1, and we find out that happened actually after Joshua died. That didn't actually happen right away. And this is one of the things that's hard about reading historical narratives in the Old Testament, because when they brought up the idea of Caleb getting his hometown, they just kind of gave you a series of events that happened. They didn't try to just limit themselves to just what happened in that year, in that month. Like we write our history more, you know, year by year, not so much, hey, here's a city and then go through all the history of that city. Here's a people and go through all the history of that people. And that's what is happening in Joshua, just like other historical narratives in the Old Testament, that very often, as you read it, it reads like you're kind of reading through a sequence, but often you're not reading in sequence. You are reading things that happen, and then a whole bunch of stuff happened, and they come back to something else that happened, you know, way earlier, and then they go through it. So they write their history more topically, rather than, sequentially by years, which is a more modern version of historical narratives. Anyway, so what we read about, and that's what I wanted to point out to you here. So notice at the beginning of chapter 1, and you'll notice that it doesn't give us any introduction to the book. You can see that it really is meant to connect to Joshua. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord. So it's like, there's no introduction. It's just like, okay, we ended the writings of Joshua, and it's written down for us how Joshua died, where he was buried, and then it says, okay, and then after he died, then the people inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. And Judah said to Simeon, his brother, and came up with me, territory. So we record for us all of Judah and Simeon going and fighting for their land down here. And then it records, a lot of what happened and the kings that they conquered. And then it tells us that the men of Judah, I think verse 8, fought against Jerusalem, captured it, struck it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire. Afterward, the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, lived in the hill country in the Negeb and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Shishai and Ahiman and Talmai. From there, they went against the inhabitants of Debir, and the name of Debir. So all of that is just kind of given generally, but Caleb is the one who actually was doing Hebron here. And it didn't kind of say that here at the beginning. It just kind of generically, because he was part of Judah. And that they just went, okay, Judah went down and started taking their land. But then it comes down and tells us, that in verse 11, or verse 12 actually, Caleb said, he who attacks Kiriath Sefer, which is Debir, and captures it, I will give him Asa, my daughter, for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. So we learn something about Othniel again. He's Caleb's younger brother. And,
Cousin or nephew?
Caleb's younger. So Kenaz. See, you can read it. So you're reading it as Kenaz is his younger brother. But and so anyway, so it mentions to us here, and it brings up the younger brother thing a couple of times here, and especially when we get to Othniel as well. And so the you have it would be odd to marry your uncle, right? And I think that's why people go, well, this is probably referring to Kenaz as his younger brother, and so it's his nephew. That may be true. I'm not sure. I kind of looked at this. I'm not sure I didn't do a lot of other reading what other people think, but I'm not sure from this quote we actually can know for sure. The phraseology would be typically more a reference to Othniel, not this, because son of just means it's Bar Jonah, Bar Jesus. That's just what son of is. And so Othniel, Bar Jesus, Othniel, Bar Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So Kenaz might be, but it could be also his younger brother. But either way, one of the things that it's his relation, either brother or nephew, and even if it's his brother, though, it's a lot younger than him. Because he's 40 when they came out of Egypt, he says. But how old did you need to be in order to enter into Israel if you weren't Caleb or Joshua? Huh? Yeah, you couldn't have been. Yeah, you had to be under 20. And so if it's his if his nephew or his younger brother, he's 20 plus years younger than Caleb. So it's a close relative that marries his daughter, and so we get a little bit more here from that. And then it says, you do get a note. Well, I'm not going to focus on that part so much. Then it talks about the Kenites, Moses' father-in-law, the descendant of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, which are not Israelites. The Kenites, remember, they're children of Abraham, but they're not children of Isaac and Jacob. And so Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, is the Kenites are his children, descendants. And so he went up with the people of Judah, and goes on. One of the things I wanted to hit, though, it says, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. There in verse 21. Now that actually dates for us to some degree, the writing. Because if the Jebusites haven't been conquered, well, it said they kind of been conquered, but the Jebusites were still kind of living in and around Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not actually taken until David. So David actually conquers Jerusalem finally and completes it, and then takes it over as his capital, and the capital of Israel. So that's, hundreds of years later. And so this is one of those instances that we read about in Judges regularly where they don't completely conquer all the people. They don't kill them all, and so they end up living amongst them. It's generally thought that Judges is probably the work of Samuel. The Jews say that. There might be some other prophets that put some recordings in there too, but probably Samuel would be the primary author, partly because he is the last judge. And he recorded a lot of this so that as they go into the kings, because he is going to anoint both Saul and David. The couple other things just to mention, a couple other verses. Okay. Well, coming down further to the last portion where they talk about, the failure to complete the conquest. So one of the things we need to essentially understand, and kind of go to this next. So they had, under Joshua, they had conquered all of the armies and all of the kings. And then the individual tribes and individual clans were supposed to go take their cities, go take their regions. And what we see is they failed to do so. And we've talked about it already in Joshua, because that's already been mentioned in Joshua, how they failed to do so. But also some of that probably happened, that failure to do so probably happened after Joshua died. Even though it's recorded in Joshua, it really is probably something that happened later. That's why Joshua is at the end of his life saying, hey, we've done everything God said we were going to do, and now you've got to go kind of take the land. But he warns them of idolatry, which we're going to find out is the primary reason that they don't finish the conquest of the land. It is their own lack of faith that will lead to all of these people not being conquered and becoming essentially conquerors of them. They're going to become, they're going to conquer some of these people, and then they're going to rule them in different periods of time. That's where the judges come in. The judges will be raised up to usually defeat the power that is in place, and and we're going to see a little bit of the kind of structure. The structure is kind of a five-fold steps. They will abandon their faith and they won't follow God, and God will punish them by letting a foreign power oppress them. And then the people will cry out to God for deliverance, and God will raise up a deliverer or judge for them. And we should understand, and then they'll have a period of peace. Okay, so really like those 5 steps, and it happens over and over and over again. But I do want to point out one thing. And if you can see all the different areas where these are all the different, so here's 7 judges and the peoples they're conquering. Some of them are coming from the north, some are coming from the south, some from the east, Philistines from the coastland. And it is very possible, especially as we read through it, we're going to notice that very often the people who will battle up here are the tribes up here. And it is quite possible that during this time that this king is kind of controlling this area of Israel, that they're not necessarily controlling the whole southern part of Israel. That these things might be quite regional. And that's why we see just certain tribes actually rise up to fight. And rather than all 12 tribes together. We don't see that typically in Judges. And so a lot of these conquests, in fact, I was thinking about this. We actually have, and a lot of us have probably followed a bit of the war in Ukraine. And how did you, before Russia invaded Ukraine, a couple weeks ago, did you remember that Russia was already occupying the whole peninsula to their south and a whole region to their east? Did you know that before that? Or did you kind of, a lot of it happened years ago, and you might forget. Well, Russia essentially was occupying whole sections of Ukraine. And so we could probably in many ways, and they did that for essentially 8 years, especially on the east side. And so we could think of this happening very similarly. So some of these kings are coming and taking some of the Israelites' territory, and they're conquering them, and they're making them pay taxes to the king, right? And like with the Midianites and Gideon, the Midianites are actually they're coming in and taking all their food, all their crops. And so Gideon is actually, when he's called, he's actually grinding the grain in a kind of in a hidden place to press out the grapes, because they were trying to hide their food from the Midianites who were coming in. So they couldn't do it out in the public because the Midianites, it's time to harvest, and Midianites come on down and take it all. And so that's essentially what's happening here, much like what Russia did by taking certain territories and then kind of enforcing different rules in those territories. A lot of that same kind of thing was happening throughout Israel. And it probably happens throughout Israel for, 400 years. Probably about the only things I really want to mention on that. So again, we see in the last part of chapter 1, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants, and then Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. On and on. Asher did not drive out. And so we get this whole list of tribes who could not drive out the people. And then we're basically in chapter 2, and we'll spend the rest of the time in 2, because this explains to us why. Okay, so coming into chapter 2, it says, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of that place Bochim, which means weeping. And they sacrificed there to the Lord. So he tells the people, you have not obeyed. Okay? And this apparently happens after Joshua's died. Remember, what did Joshua, we looked at his last words the last couple of Wednesdays. And what was his primary warning to them?
Don't intermix.
Yeah, don't intermix. You need to do what God said. You need to conquer these people. You need to put them to death. Because God was judging these nations, and he had condemned them to death because of their wickedness. And Israel was supposed to be the sword that was doing that, but they did not do that. Instead, they became like them. And Joshua was warning them, you need to put away the idols, but they didn't put away the idols. So, okay. Any thoughts on that beginning part of just the explanation about why they did not? Basically, God, because of their lack of faith and lack of obedience, God basically said, I'm not going to conquer these people for you now. There are going to be difficulties for you. You're going to live amongst them. Their gods are going to be a snare for you. And what do you mean? What does he mean by a snare? What do you think that means? A trap, yeah. You might think a test. I mean, he tests, a lot of people tested Abraham, right? Gives us tests, and he talks about it later. I think in chapter 3, I think we'll see a little bit more of that they became a test for them.
Why do you think they didn't drive him out, even destroy him completely, like they were told?
Because I think they were already not obeying. I think they had not put away the idols. They still had the idols of their fathers. That's why Joshua was telling them at the end of his life, you need to put away the idols that are for your fathers. He didn't say you need to not go to their idols. He said you need to put away your idols. They were already not being faithful. And it just grew worse after Joshua and the elders when they came in initially. They weren't a perfect people. They weren't a completely, well, and it also will tell us here in a bit that much of this happens to the generation that comes right after. So those who rise up who did not see all that God did with them in the wilderness and then in Canaan and then conquering all of these things, those that kind of grow up with the fatted calf, don't understand, the cost it took for them to live in this promised land. This is one of the reasons, in fact, it's going to be a point for this lesson this Sunday, the idea about just one generation to the next and how generations often are different situationally. So you think about the baby boomers after, born to all the post-World War II parents, and they grew up primarily in plenty and with lots and everything available, work and money, everything growing, everything just great, but the parents of them who fought in World War II and who lived through the Depression had a very different experience in life. And so they had a very different, work ethic, different toughness, a different grit, we might call it. And so, it's hard to give people who grow up with a silver spoon in their mouth, and really the baby boom generation for the most part did. Now that's not every individual, but it's as a generation, it had so much more than the generation before them. And so it changes something about you, And I think that same exact thing happens to Israel over and over again, generation to generation. One will be kind of faithful and then they'll fall, and over and over again happens. We can go to Samuel and his sons, David and his sons. I mean, over and over again, we see really faithful people having children who just aren't faithful. Or a child who raises up who has parents who weren't very faithful. And so, yeah. I think, they were intermixing with them. They were intermarrying with them. They were, and we should remember that the idols that their fathers had brought from, the land like Babylon and all that to the east, way over here in the on the map. Abraham and his family, they brought idols with them. His dad had idols. His brothers had idols. Even when Isaac and Jacob, get wives from, his brother's area up in Nahor, which is kind of up in this region, kind of on the maps. When Abraham sends, Isaac or his servant to go get Isaac a wife, he wants it to be from his own clan, and they all had idols. That's why Rachel is hiding them, stealing them from her father, when Jacob and her are coming back to Canaan. And that really, they still had them in Egypt. They still have them as they came up. And so we don't think about it a lot of times, that they really had never quite cleaned up their life completely. But I think this is a really good lesson for us, though. How many people become Christians and struggle to completely clean up their lives? Every aspect of it.
Most.
Yeah. Almost all of them. Because we're all tempted. We all have temptations. We all have things that even before a commitment to Jesus, there are things in this world, this life, that we just are drawn to and that we are tempted by, and it is hard to clean that out. And even sometimes you think, I've done it. But then it all of a sudden sneaks back up on you, So I think they're doing the same kinds of things we do, in that sense. Any other thoughts about? Okay. Then we actually get another kind of telling about the death of Joshua. Joshua dismissed the people. So notice the beginning of chapter 1 after Joshua died, and now we come in 2:6, and Joshua is dismissing the people. Wow, that's quite a talent from the grave. But no, we're kind of moving back and forth in the timeline here. To dismiss them, they all went to their inheritance to take possession of the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaish. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. What does it mean by they don't know the Lord or the work he had done?
Well, because is that something you could almost blame on the parents for not telling them? Or do you think this is just a defiant ignorance of it?
Or is it possibly a degree of knowing them, as in they didn't experience what their parents experienced?
Mm-hmm.
So a deeper knowledge.
Yeah, I think this is very much like, now, it is possible that they are not being taught well by their parents. Very possible. But we do see, for example, when we come to Gideon is going to have been told about all of the great miraculous stuff that happened out of Egypt. He apparently wasn't told all the other stuff God said too, but he was told those things. He had told about all those great things that had happened, those powerful miracles and wonders and all that, but he had never seen it. And I think that's what it's essentially referring to. So this word knowing is typically also, I was kind of looking at it real quickly, but, so I don't know for sure, but typically this word knowing is the word also used for sex. And so it has actually this idea of experience, what you experience. And so it's not the same to go to school and learn about World War II as it is to experience the war, is it? Because it wasn't just the people who went and fought, most of whom came back probably with PTSD because of the horrific things they had seen and witnessed. And most of them, that whole generation for the most part, did not like talking about war at all. And not uncommon, pretty common thing for people coming back from war to not want to talk about the horrors they have experienced. But at that time, they didn't understand, the post-traumatic stress like we do now better. And so for us to read about it or to watch a movie is not the same thing as having lived it. And it wasn't just the people that went and fought. I mean, I had a good friend who passed away a few years ago. But she had told me one time about the stories of kind of growing up in the Valley of California and how her and her sister, they would pick tar off of, I can't remember if it was off the telephone poles or like electric poles, those wooden poles, and they had like tar on it, and they would chew on it because they didn't have bubble gum. It had been taken away. It's like, you don't even, a lot of times, until you've experienced it, you often don't realize the things people gave up for a number of years because, all of a sudden, all of the manufacturing was devoted to war things, and it was taken away. They weren't manufacturing a lot of, normal products. Everything was geared towards, hey, you just eat enough to survive, and then we're gonna, we're at war, and both sides of the world. And so, and not that by itself is, the most horrific thing to do, but the people who even were here typically, because they went into the war, people were poor for the most part. And the war, during the war years you had to do without a lot. And so we can read about that, we can watch movies about it. It's not the same, is it? As actually having lived it, experienced it. I think that's actually what he's talking about. So he's talking about a generation that didn't experience anything.
But they heard about it.
They probably heard about it, maybe not enough. But I think they had heard to some degree. But it just, and what do young people do? I don't think their young people were a lot different than our young people now. What do young people do when old people tell them about the past?
Don't listen.
Huh?
They don't listen.
They don't listen. Yeah.
Just
It's like,
roll their eyes.
I'm almost done
Uh-huh.
talking. Now, I don't know. I do think in their culture they might not have rolled their eyes quite as much, because I think they probably would have gotten fists upside the head and stuff. But and so, I think they're a little more afraid of their parents in this time frame. But I still don't think, they would have, when you didn't experience it and you just came and you've grown up in a place that you had plenty. Remember, that's what they're coming into. That's what God brought them to, right? A land of plenty. So this is a generation who grew up with everything they needed and everything they would want. And yeah.
I was going to say that this seems to follow the admonitions that both Moses gave to the people and Joshua gave to the people, telling them not to forget God.
Right.
And so, did the people fail in teaching and living God to their children, and so therefore they did not know them? It reminds me of the instance where, going back to when Joseph, when the children of Israel were going into captivity, the phrase that it used there is that now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
Right.
Now, did he not know Joseph?
Right.
I mean, the the Egyptian
Right.
dynasties were notoriously, memorialized.
Yes.
So chances
Yeah.
are he knew Joseph.
Right. And
he
we
just
talked
didn't
about
have
the,
respect
yeah,
for
we
Joseph.
talked about this at that time too. I kind of mentioned the same thing. I do think that he understood who Joseph had been, but I do think the new kings that rose up were also completely against the Hyksos and Joseph, a Hebrew, and they were getting rid of, because the Hyksos, Joseph might have been part of all that. The Hyksos were they served one God. Well, the Egyptians as a rule served lots of gods. And then after the Hyksos, a king, emperors arose in Egypt that went back to their multiplicity of gods, Ra and all the rest that we read about or see in movies. And so yeah, I think that's the idea of knowing. Usually this word means something that you really have a connection to, not just you've heard about.
Right. And I think that their children did not get connected to
Yes.
God like they were.
Didn't take it to heart.
Right.
But that's hard for kids, isn't it?
Well, that's the reason they were admonished so much
Yeah.
by Joshua, by
Right.
Moses. It's like, don't forget.
That's the hard thing about being a kid who gets that age where you realize, damn, my parents were right. And they were right. They said stuff, they warned you, right? But you didn't think they knew anything. Times are different now. Doing exactly this. Like all the kids today, and I was having a conversation with somebody recently, if you're like 30, you could probably, somebody who's 20 might listen to you. They won't listen to me because they don't think I understand it. I haven't, dementia hasn't hit me that bad yet. But the reality is I remember like yesterday being a teenager. And you will most likely most of your life, as long as your mind is working pretty well. Like those of us who are older, do you remember being a teenager, being in the 20s? In fact, I still feel like I'm probably 30, physically. Don't laugh, Jesse. I can outwalk you on the golf course any day. But I'm not. And sometimes when I work out, I actually kind of realize, oh, man, I can't work out as hard. I used to, typically would work out, weights and stuff 3 times a week. I only do it twice now. My body needs more recovery time. It's just the natural process of getting older. But I have to keep being reminded of it. Well, my body keeps reminding me of it. And it's just the way life kind of goes. We just don't think, and I don't really think it has changed. Now, I do think what we call a generation is oftentimes only 18, 20 years now. And that's probably just because how much things change in recent decades. But, in the ancient world, they thought more of like closer to 40 years for a generation. But things probably changed about a lot slower in their time frame. I mean, you were going to be raised in your parents' household. You were going to get the same crops every year. You were going to, thresh out the grain the exact same way every year. And you were going to do that for your whole life. Now, there might be certain reasons, family or something, you might have to move, but for the most part, you were going to be in one little location for your whole life. And you were going to do the exact same work, the exact same way that your ancestors had done it for your whole life. So generations might have changed a little slower, but I think we still see the same thing now that's going on then. People just don't think, they always think things have changed and things are new and they're not like it was when you were young, in the ancient world. No. No. Any other thoughts?
I think
Okay,
it's
okay.
very applicable to us today.
Mm-hmm.
If we want our children to be faithful to God, we need to live it and show it to our children
Yeah.
so that they get to know God.
Yeah. And even if our children don't like being told the lessons of life, we still have to tell them. it's parents' responsibility to tell your children the biblical lessons of life, whether they like to hear it or don't like to hear it, whether it's in season to listen or out of season, which is exactly what preachers are told, by Paul. You just keep preaching it when they want to hear it, when they don't want to hear it. So, yeah. So that's all the parents can do, and because the kids are going, and every kid will have this. You will grow up and you will realize that being an adult is probably a little different than you expected. You thought you'd be different, and then you realize it's like, maybe you grew up with a parent that said things, you go, I'm never going to do what my parents did. I'm never going to say the things my parents said. And then it hits you the first time you do it. You're like, oh, man, I just said what they used to tell me. I hate that. Okay. So this next little midsection of chapter 2 says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord. Now, this is what they did after Joshua and the elders. So we should understand that this portion of chapter 2 here is essentially what, even though it comes after the first section of chapter 2, is probably what happened before the angel told them this about their unfaithfulness. Because that happened after Joshua died, and in this portion we have the death of Joshua, and now we're coming and saying what happened to this generation who did not know the Lord. And it says they did evil, and they served the Baals. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And we're going to read about it later. Gideon will cut down an Asherah pole. Those are essentially poles. The Ashtaroths were worshipped usually with a pole, and that was essentially planted into the ground. And it says and you'll see Gideon will chop it one down. It says the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned. And the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So they were actually warned by Moses and Joshua that if they were not faithful, God would stop fighting for them, and he would also then begin to fight against them. Those warnings had already been told them. Now, maybe this part of the law was not being taught to the children very well. Maybe the warnings, because we're going to see Gideon, he's going to not, when we get to Gideon, we're going to, I think in a couple of weeks, but Gideon is surprised, why don't we see all these miracles and stuff? But then he doesn't seem to be at all surprised by, why do we have Baal, altars to Baal and an Asherah pole, and when God said we shouldn't have them? He doesn't ask those questions, right? Instead, his father had him on his land. And so he grew up with these altars to Baal and these Asherah poles. But he's going, I don't know why God's not doing good stuff for us. Well, he probably wasn't aware that God said, you do these things, I'm not going to be with you. And so that's what, essentially is being written down. And, they don't have, at this time when they're going through this, this is a historical narrative that comes probably quite a bit after, or at least towards the end of the Judges. And so they're not being given necessarily a lot of, they don't have scriptures to read to warn them. They need their parents to warn them. And for their parents to warn them, what do their parents need?
To not have altars.
To not have altars, yeah. But they don't have their own scriptures. The Bibles, they didn't have their own Bibles. These were way too expensive for any family to have. Maybe a tribe could have, but essentially the priest's job were to be teaching them the scriptures, the law all the time, so that they could teach their children the law, because they had to teach it from being told it. So, anyway. Okay, well, we'll end there. We got kids coming out. You got singing, right, Dave?
They do, yeah.
Okay. So, we'll pick it up from here, and we'll talk about the very beginning, from 16 on to the chapter 2, and then we'll go into chapter 3 and talk about the first couple of Judges. All right.